I'm going to say it again. The message that I intend to bring to you today is a message that every advertiser, everyone selling something in the world, wants to make sure that you don't hear it and you don't understand it. But Paul said this about the message today. He said, there is a secret. He said, there's a secret to what I want to tell you. And by secret, he doesn't mean this thing that is hidden from us. You ever walked through life and felt like everyone else knew something that you didn't? And if there was this secret to life that if you could just get hold of, maybe you could read a book or watch a YouTube video or someone could tell it to you, then your life would work. You just needed to know the secret to it. Well, when Paul talks about this secret, he's not talking about something that's hidden. He's talking about something that is key and essential to what he's bringing. The secret sauce. You ever heard of that? It's this thing, it's this key ingredient that you have to have. And I will go ahead and tell you, as far as I know, there is no hidden secret to life. Just like the girls' volleyball team, the reason they get there is because of hard work and practice and teamwork. And none of those things are hidden or a surprise to anyone. And the same is true with life. There is no hidden secret that you could just grab hold of. It's just plain, obvious things that you learn to do day in and day out the right kind of way. We talk sometimes to some of our folks around here about just do the next right thing. You know, just learn to do the next right thing. So what am I talking about? Let's see if you can pick it up. Go to Philippians. Philippians chapter 4. Paul is closing out his letter to the church at Philippi. And here is what he says in verse 11. Not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means. I also know how to live in prosperity in any and every circumstance. I have learned the secret of being fulfilled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So what's the secret? The thing that he's talking about is contentment in life. Being content. There's an interesting thing about this word. When you look it up in the Greek, it's the only time in the entire Bible that this word is used. That word in the Greek for content is the only time you will find it in the Bible, and it is universally translated this way. If you've ever learned how to study and do word studies and look things up, you know that when you look at a Greek word, sometimes you will find various ways to translate that. And translators will use various words trying to get at the heart of the Greek word. But this is not the case. It is the one time it is used in all of the Bible, and almost universally there is only one way to translate it into English, and it is content. To be content. And now you know why, I hope, I started the message the way that I did. Because no advertiser in America wants you to be content. No one selling anything wants you to be content. In order to move their product and get you to do what they want you to do, they actually have to create a level of discontent. And so Paul tells us that he has learned to be content. Do you see that? You don't come out of the womb being content. We come out of the womb wanting, right? Wanting warmth, wanting milk, wanting nurture, and we want all the days of our life. I want to suggest to you today that contentment is not something that you're just naturally going to be good at. You have to, like Paul, learn to be content. And how did Paul learn to be content? I think he learned about it in the good and in the bad. But have you ever noticed, and I think we've said it before, that some of the greatest lessons in life come from the hardships in our life, right? And so I wanted to just show you some of the hardships. So while we were traveling this summer and we went to some different areas in Greece, looking at the early churches and following in the steps of Paul and all those things, we came upon some of the places where Paul was imprisoned. And I wanted to show them to you today. Paul was down in that hole, it's believed. It was a cistern in Caesarea, which is right on the ocean. One of the most beautiful places I think we'd ever been, right? It was so beautiful. And can you imagine Paul is stuck down in this watery cistern that had been turned into a prison and just dropped into this thing that looks like a hole. Here's another view as it would come from another side. Those bars are not original, and neither is that fence, by the way. But he's underground. He's being held in prison underground in Caesarea. And then here's another prison in Philippi. And again, that gate is not original. And then here's what it looks like inside. Just a stone cutout that he would spend his days in. And we're reading in Philippians. And Paul wrote this very letter in prison, not one of the ones that I showed you there. To the letter to the Philippians, Paul is believed to have been in prison in Rome. And Paul was he experienced the prison life quite a bit. He was no stranger to being in prison. So how does a man who spends a lot of his life being captured and in prison and bound in chains say, I have learned to be content? I have learned to be content. In fact, I want to read a little bit of Paul's autobiography, because a lot of times when people tell you stuff, the first thing that we want to do as a reaction is say, well, you don't know what it's like to be me. Anybody ever done that? Somebody try to give you advice and you're like, you don't know what it's like to be in my circumstances and to be in my situation. And in this case, you're like, maybe Paul doesn't know what he's talking about when he tells us that we ought to learn how to be content. Paul, you don't know what I've been through. Well, I want to ask you, do you know what Paul's been through? Are you familiar with what Paul went through? Because maybe Paul went through some things that you haven't even gone through. He certainly went through some things that I haven't gone through. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, this is a bit of his biography or autobiography of suffering. Listen to some of the things that he's been through. 5 times, see the number 5? 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I've spent in the deep. I've been on frequent journeys in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers from the city, dangers from the wilderness, dangers from the sea, dangers from the false brethren. I think he'd been in some danger, don't you think? Absolutely. I've been in labor and hardship, through many sleepless nights and hunger and in thirst, often without food. I've been in cold and exposure. Apart from such external things, there's the daily pressure. Ooh, anybody know anything about the daily pressure? That's what we call it, the pressures of life. Does Paul know anything about that? Apart from such external things, there's the daily pressures on me of the concern for all the churches. He is carrying the weight of these early churches that he started in his heart. Will they succeed? Will they make it? Are these churches going to survive? Yeah, that's a lot. He said in verse 29, who is weak without my being weak? Who is led into sin without my intense concern? If I had to boast, I will boast of what pertains to my weakness. Woo! That's some autobiography. So I'm thinking that if that man wrote and said, I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am in, Paul, you got my ear. And here's what I think he is trying to express to us, and I wrote it in the form of an equation because sometimes I want to just break this thing down just as simply as I can possibly get it so I can remember it. And so I've done that for you today. And here's what I think he is trying to tell us, is that you can be content with things, but you can also be content without things. Now, let's don't move on from slides too quickly. Let's hang out there for a minute. Paul said that he'd learned to be content, and if you read his list, he was content when he had things, when he had a lot of things, when he had enough of things. That ain't hard to do. Maybe. That next one's a little tougher, though, isn't it? I've learned to be content without things, without food, without clothing, without shelter, without. Which then leads me to take that thought just a little bit further, and you see if this is true of your own experiences. You can be miserable with things, and you can be miserable without things. There any of you that ever got some things and realize, well, I'm just as miserable now as I was before. And I had so much hope in this thing. And yet I'm miserable all over again. And how many of you have been miserable without things? So what I want to suggest, let's go back just to make sure we're all on the same page, following the same equation. Paul said he'd learned to be content with or without. And I believe from our own personal experience, we could say that we can also be miserable with or without. And so then the conclusion of this all is contentment has nothing to do with things. Did you hear that? I believe that is the conclusion that we're to arrive at, is that contentment isn't dependent upon things or circumstances. What Paul had learned, the secret, was that there was a kind of contentment that was deeper than what he possessed, and it was deeper than what he was going through. And is there anyone in the room today at all interested in that kind of contentment in life? Okay, good. I've had one hand, so I'm going to preach to you, okay? And me. All right, I'm preaching to you. We're going to work this thing out. Do any of you believe that the world is just full of discontent? When you look around, do you see it in so many places that you turn? Just a high level of discontent wherever you go. That people just seem to not find happiness, to be in misery. And I've asked myself why that is, and I can't help but believe, and you can come up with your own reasons, but I can't help but believe that some of it is because the world is so interconnected now through technology that we can know what's going on with our friends and with people across the world, and social media puts us in touch with all of those things, that life becomes this comparison of what I have and what I'm doing with what other people have and what they're doing. And the level of discontent, the level of misery seems to be really steep. I'm not one of those people, by the way, that thinks the world is a lot worse than it used to be. I know that you'll hear that all the time, how bad the world is. But I keep going back and I'm like, I can't find a sin that we're sinning that they weren't sinning a long time ago. Did that make sense? I can't find one that we're sinning today that they weren't sinning yesterday. Now, we found some creative ways to do them. But when I look at it, I think Solomon's right. There isn't anything new under the sun. We're doing the same old things we used to do. But I do feel like there's some level that it's like people just don't seem happy. They don't seem to be content. Wow, we're not content. And then I think this message is timely. I didn't necessarily plan it this way, but maybe the Holy Spirit did, because we're coming upon the holidays. Oh, you know where I'm going with this already, don't you? Have you ever noticed that the season that is meant to draw us to thankfulness, Thanksgiving, the season that is meant to draw us to Jesus, is the very time in our lives where it seems like the pace of our life picks up to a point that is almost breakneck speed. There are things to go to, and there are parties, and there are presents to buy, and there are shopping lines, and there's no parking places. And all of those things hit you at once, and it is like, I can't wait until this whole celebration of Jesus thing is over. Maybe we hadn't been celebrating Jesus after all. Maybe we lost. I'm not telling anything new right there, right? Maybe we lost what everything was about. And so I think it's important for me to preach this today and for us to talk about it today, because we're moving into a season that is the craziest thing. It's supposed to be about everything I'm talking about today, about contentment. And yet the advertisers and the sellers and your friends and everyone else is going to try to push you into being and making you discontent. So I think it's worth talking about. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us a whole lot about how to work this thing out, but Paul seems to tell us that we have to be careful of our attachments. Does that make sense? You have to be careful of what your heart is attached to. The monks would say it this way. They would say you need to detach from things that are not good for you. That's actually, I believe, part of the secret. The secret has two parts. One of the secrets to contentment is this. You've got to start detaching from some things that don't matter. You're going to have to detach from things that erode your peace. You're going to have to detach from things that cause you to worry. And that actually is possible. So I want to go over some things, and let's talk about detaching, and then we'll get to the second part of the secret. Is that okay? One, we got to detach from possessions. And I can't even look at y'all right now. Because like you, I'm so sick of hearing this. Aren't you? You're like, that preacher going to talk about the same old thing. About how we got to, possessions are bad. And how we got to be careful with things. And you're sick of hearing it, and I'm sick of preaching about it. I thought if we just be honest, we might figure out how to move forward from here, right? I'm so sick of us talking about possessions, and yet those things are like doggone octopuses with tentacles. It's like you think you have figured it out, and then all of a sudden, someone shows you something, and you're like, I have got to have that. Or your friends take a picture with it on Facebook, and you're like, I don't have that. And all of a sudden, we go down this road again. And here's what I think we ought to do. About once a year, we ought to take everybody in church and take them out to the landfill and have a service out there. And then, you remember when you used to go to church on Sunday morning and you go to church on Sunday night? So here's what we do. Sunday morning, we go out to the landfill and we'd hold church. And then on Sunday evening, we go out to the scrapyard and we'd hold church. And if we held church at the landfill and the scrapyard, I could stand up as a pastor and say, here's all those things you thought were going to make you happy. And I would say, guess what? Some of your stuff's in there too. And I say, guess what? I'm not throwing stones because guess what? Landfill's got some of my stuff in it too. I just took some down about 2 weeks ago. Took some stuff off to the scrapyard too. And so I think that about twice a year, we ought to hold a morning and an evening service at the landfill and the scrapyard to remind ourselves that some of this stuff that we have attached ourselves to is just like what Jesus said. Remember what he said over on the Sermon on the Mount? Be careful where your treasures are. Because if your treasures are in these earthly things, guess what he said will happen? He said the moth will come and eat some holes and you'll find garments. And the rust will come and it will put rust on all those fine things that you're holding on to. And guess what? Those thieves will come and all that stuff that you've been trying to store up and say, guess what? They'll steal it. And along with it, steal your peace and joy. And so I know you are tired of hearing it, and I am tired of saying it. But at some point, we have to do more than be hearers of the word. And here's one of the things that I think is particularly scary about this, is if we are too attached to things, to possessions, then it even affects our relationship with God. You say, Kevin, how does it affect our relationship with God? Because then you approach God as a supplier of the things you need. You approach God as a supplier, meaning that why do you pray? Because it's something you want, and God is the one that can supply it, you hope. And so you pray so that He'll supply you with the things that you want. And then it gets sideways with us and God. Why? Because God is not a supplier. God is the source. What's that old saying? People say, don't get it backwards. Don't get that one backwards. Don't get it twisted. That's it. Yeah. I ain't ever been accused of being current, whatever that is. Ask yourself this question. Does your prayer life, does it sound like one who is approaching a supplier or one who is approaching the source of all of life? We should evaluate the way we approach God. Next thing, we need to detach from outcomes and of trying to control them. I just stopped preaching and went to meddling, didn't I? I'm like, oh, the preacher is meddling today in my business. Paul was in prison. You don't have much control when you're in prison. They tell you what you'll eat. They tell you a lot of things. And so Paul is in a situation where he doesn't have much control. And yet I have found that as Christians, we are some of the most controlling people that you will meet in the world. I almost think we're more controlling than unbelievers because we got God and we know what's going on and we about to tell everyone. Right? Like we have cornered the market on the truth, and so we about to tell everyone how they're supposed to live their life. And we try to control everything. Why do we do that? It seems that it's rooted in this thing that the world is just very uncertain. Have you noticed that? The world is uncertain, the world is unpredictable, the world is unstable, and there's something inside of us that wants to create security, that we want to create some level of organization around things, and so we try to control things. But we don't just try to control things. No, we won't stop at just controlling things. We know that to truly control things, you got to control people. That's why I love preaching to y'all, because you're so smart. Man, Christians, we love to control people. And if we've been studying through the book of Job, one thing ought to be clear at this point, and if it's not, let me see if I can bring it back around. You and I are not smart enough to control the world for a 24-hour period of time. Can I go ahead and just say that one more time? I told you y'all are smart, and I believe you are. I'm not trying to butter your bread. But you are not smart enough, and I am not smart enough to control the world for a 24-hour period of time. And sometimes I have to remind myself that I'm not smart enough to even know what God is doing in the moment. I mean, I believe that God is in control, but if you were to ask me, what is God doing right now? Most of the time, and I would look at that and go, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what He's doing. But do you know, I believe that's actually the most honest way a Christian could live. Is say, I'm not sure what He's doing, but I trust Him. That's what Job came to realize. He said, I don't know what God's doing, but I trust Him. And this illusion that we know what's best, this illusion that we know what's best for unbelievers, this illusion that we know what's best for our children. Brantley and I are in a new season of our life. We're parenting an adult child. Some of y'all have already done that. I'm kind of new to it. I wish somebody had wrote a little more on it. You know, when he was little, we could kind of control some things. But he's 21 years old. And he don't live in our house anymore. And he's bigger than me, so I can't whoop him. He's a grown man. And it is interesting for us to pastor an adult because you realize you don't have any control. You have some influence, but you don't have control. But I'm actually starting to enjoy it a little bit. Not always. But I love the talks that we get to have. And then me say, son, you got to decide. And the reason that's so good is because if I didn't control the input, I'm not responsible for the output. Then if it all goes to put, and then he comes back, I'm like, I don't know, son, that was your choice. I'm just kidding. Here's a prayer. Some of you know it. It's part of the Serenity Prayer. Everyone know that? Here's a line from the Serenity Prayer. Taking as he did, that means Jesus, taking as he did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it to be. Wow. That'll give you some contentment, by the way. Another word for that, serenity, which is this. If Jesus could take this broken world as it was and come right down into the middle of it and not force anyone into a decision for him, then can't we do the same? Can't we live life taking it the way that it comes at us and not as we think that it ought to be? You ever lived in the should haves and the wish you would haves and the must haves of trying to force life to conform to our wishes only to realize that it just won't? And then learning to live life like open-handed. My dad's 91 years old, and I haven't talked about him in a while, so I'll talk about him today. I'm watching him as he's learning how to just hold life loosely. Reverend Clausen is laughing over here because it's something that you need a little age to get it, I think. When it comes to possessions, I said this, and some of you may have heard it. We spend the first portion of our life with a bag, and we're trying to fill our life up with everything that everybody told us we're supposed to have, we're supposed to do, and what's going to make us have a great family and a great career and all those things. We just keep pouring more stuff into our bag. And then some point you get to this age in life and you realize, more was not better. More is a burden. And then you start pulling stuff out and unloading stuff because you're like, this stuff is just causing me more pain and heartache, and I need to get rid of some stuff. And I'm watching my dad walk through that, and he's kind of holding some stuff loosely, and he's working on this thing, and it's like, oh, it's beautiful. Oh, if you're a senior in the room, y'all keep doing it. We need to figure it out, and we're going to learn it through watching y'all. Taking as he did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it to be. And then let me move through fairly quickly. The third one, we need to detach from people's perceptions and opinions and expectations. Now we got a lot of approval. Yeah. I would be one of those. People pleasers, right? People, and you don't even have to go to that extreme, but just this desire for people to like you. For people to say nice things about us, to be validated, the fear that we have of being rejected and being lonely. I think it's why we make bad choices with the people we spend our lives with, is because I didn't want to be lonely. Yeah, and it's like, yeah, you're not lonely, but you sure are miserable. That truth has come out of some post-marriage counseling moments, by the way. If you just want to know where that little truth bomb came from, it came from doing some post-marriage counseling. Why did you get married? Because we were lonely, and he was going to complete me. And I'm like, well, that's good, because you're not lonely anymore. But you sure do look miserable. It boils down to, are we going to nourish our souls, or are we going to nourish the image of who the world sees us as? Can I say that again? You gotta choose. Do you want to nourish your soul? And if you are, you're going to have to get to that place, we all are, where we don't care about what some people are saying. Or are we going to nourish the image of ourselves that we present to the world? And if I could tie that back to the last point, the reason that we're so concerned by perception and opinion and expectation is because even deep inside of us is this desire, listen to this, to control that. To control people's perception. To control people's opinion. And to control people's expectation. I've been trying to work on this one thing, and it's talking about what tasks are yours. So what are your tasks? Your task is to walk through life the way that God has called you to walk through life, doing the things that God has called you to do in the timing that God has called you to do them in, and how people perceive you or what they think of you. Guess what? That is not your task. You have to detach from that because it is not your task. So then this thing called the American Dream, anybody ever heard of it? Brantley and I were talking about that, and Brantley said, whoever fed us the American Dream, they were not content. I was like, that is brilliant. So I'm going to say that again. That was my wife down here on the front row. We were just talking about the American dream, right? You got to have all these things to be a part of the American dream. She said, you know what? Whoever said that was not a content person. I was like, you're absolutely right. I think they were selling something, don't you? I think the American dream came from people who were trying to sell us some stuff. And so then it becomes about this ideal, right? I wrote a few of them down. See if you've ever heard this somewhere, this expectation that you got to have the ideal spouse. And the ideal kids, and the ideal house that's in the ideal neighborhood, that's parked out front with the ideal car, and you drive to the ideal career, and you have ideal friends, and you go to an ideal church. And then Jesus told his disciples, you should be careful because you can gain the world and lose your soul. Be careful, Jesus said, because you can gain all of that and still lose your soul. So as Christians, we don't live in, there is no Christian ideal. There is no American ideal. You know how Christians live? We live in hope. There is no ideal spouse. There is no ideal career. There is no ideal church. There is no ideal Christian. So what are we to do? We don't live based on Christian ideals because it's a myth. It doesn't exist. We live in a Christian hope that we are becoming more like Christ every day. We live in hope, not by these ideals. You want to know when you're starting to live by that ideal? Is people start making you frustrated. Your wife frustrates you. This one doesn't. Your job makes you frustrated. Your church makes you frustrated. Everybody makes you frustrated. When you're frustrated, it's a sign. Did you know that? When you lose contentment, it is a sign, it is a pointer, and it is trying to alert you that you have set your contentment on something that is wrong. I'm going to say that again. The way you know when this thing is off track is you lose contentment and you feel it. You know what it feels like. You get frustrated easily. You get angry. You feel sped up inside. Everything's moving too fast. You don't have enough time to do all the things that you want to do. And you're like, what is that? That is being discontented. You have lost contentment. And those emotions are supposed to tell us that so that we can get on track. So let me kind of wrap things up with a story where some of this came home to me. So y'all know I spent the month of August with the monks in a monastery. And so, they gave me the packing list to take, and it wasn't much. You don't really need much. And so I'm going down, and we're almost there, and Brantley looks at me, and she says, did you get any money out of the ATM? And I was like, no, I don't. I think everything's provided. I don't think I need any money for anything. She's like, you always need money for something. You should always have money on you. She said, we are stopping by the ATM. And I'm like, okay, let's stop by the ATM. So we stopped by the ATM, and I'm like, how much do you think I should get out? And she said, I don't know, at least get out $40. And I'm like, okay. And so we got out $40 at the ATM, and I put it in this very wallet. Put it right in there. Got down to the monastery, and I was like trying to empty my pockets, because you can't carry a phone, and and so you're having to kind of detach from some things. It's actually why I went, is to detach from everything that had an on button. That didn't even make the list, right? But you may not have ever thought about that, but there was a world in which that actually occurred, and I wanted to get back to it. I wanted to live for a little bit with things that didn't have on buttons. And so, it was to get rid of that. It was to not have to talk a lot. I talk more on Sunday mornings at this time than I do like most any other time. And so I thought, oh, this is going to be great. I'm going to love it. My sister's nodding over there. You might talk just a little more than me. And so you're not talking, and you're just getting back to the simplicities of life. And so I walk into my room, and I think you heard it. There is a bed and a desk and a bathroom. And I'm like, ooh, okay. And so I took my wallet, because I didn't know what to do with it, and I set it on the desk. And about 3 weeks later, I realized the wallet was right where I had put it. It was still on that desk. And I started thinking about that for a minute. In fact, I grabbed the wallet and I looked inside and I pulled out those two $20 bills and I looked at them and I said, for the first time in my life, I am somewhere where money is as worthless as confetti. It was worthless. I could not think of a good reason to have it. There was nothing to buy. In fact, one day I thought about this. There was a guy, he did something nice for me. And I was like, oh, it was so nice of him. I want to repay him. I'm like, well, that won't work because they don't even operate in money around here. What would he do with it? I'm like, what would a monk do if you gave him money? There's nothing to do with it. And so for the first time in my life, I'm in a place and money has no value. And that got my mind operating too. And I was like, no doors are locked. There are no locked doors around here. And so I went around and tested it for a little bit. Yeah, I'd just go, and if I didn't know where something was, I would just open the door and see what was inside. Because I was like, I'm new here. I can always say I didn't know, right? And so I'd open a door, and there'd be like, if there were garden rakes and tools, and stuff like that. There was stuff there, but none of it is locked. And I'm like, because who's going to break in to a monastery? Like, if you break into a monastery, I hope this doesn't offend anybody, but that's like next level dumb. I mean, like if you break into a monastery thinking you're going to get something out of a monastery, you are dumb at a whole nother level. There is nothing there to take. And that's why all the doors are open. And so then all of a sudden I start going back to this. Store up for yourselves treasure where? In heaven. Where neither moth nor rust, nor thieves break in and steal. And so for the first time in my life, I'm in a place where everything has been stripped away. And you know what it made room for? Secret number 2. The reason you detach from the things that don't matter, you know where I'm going now, right? Is so you can attach to the things that do. I wonder how long some of us are going to move through life and never get around to making time for God. Can I ask you that again? How long are you going to keep going through life and never make room for God? If you want to make room for God, you're going to have to detach from some things in order to attach to the right things. And we've already talked about what those right things are. It was a message we did, and Sean and I kind of double-teamed it. It's a message from Romans, right? What are the things that we attach to? Romans says this: we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, right? And then we go through things, and it produces in us perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope doesn't disappoint because the love of God has been poured out in our hearts. What are we attaching to? I suggest to you these final 3 things. One is you have to attach to the peace with God. Peace with God. The love of God. And hope in God. Second part of the secret. The reason you detach from the stuff that doesn't matter is so that you can attach to what does matter. What does matter? Peace with God matters. The love of God matters. Hope in God matters. So here's what I want you to do. I asked Brantley if we could do this too. It's before Monday morning starts, I would love for you to spend some time alone. I'd love for you to spend some time, if you are married, with your spouse and have a conversation. Can I be so bold as to ask you to do that? Spend some time alone. Some of you are smiling. You know what I'm about ready to ask you to do, don't you? For anybody who's like, no, I don't know what you're getting ready to ask me to do. Do this. See if there's some things you need to detach from, that you need to let go of, that you need to disconnect your heart from. And then we're coming up on Thanksgiving, and we're coming up on Christmas. And it could be the most chaotic, frenzied, busy time that you can imagine if you let it be. But what you could do is sit down with yourself and the Holy Spirit, or your significant other and the Holy Spirit, and say, what is it that God would want this season to look like? Would He want us to have more peace and more love and more hope? And if so, how are we going to live this season? How many gatherings are we going to go to? Because I guarantee you could go to one every night. A little, a company party and a church party and a friend party, and then you got to buy presents for everyone and all those things. What if somebody just said, you know what, I'm just not doing it this year. I'm not going to all the parties, and I'm not buying all the stuff, and we're going to sit down and we're going to figure out how to walk through in a contented kind of way a season that puts Jesus first. So that it is no longer about Jesus being the supplier of my Christmas tree, but the sustainer of life. One last quick story. Do you have time for this? This one's very personal. I don't like Christmas. I don't like Christmas. You're like, why don't you like Christmas? You're a pastor, and it's about Jesus. And I'm like, have you ever been through Christmas? Because as a pastor, I can tell you the one thing that it is not is about Jesus. Why is it that I don't like Christmas? Y'all don't even know this. I'm sorry about this, okay? My dad used to own a television repair shop called Taylor's TV Town. Owned a little place over on Columbia Street in Chester, right before you got to the bypass where you could turn left to go to the high school. Little shop right there. And he worked hard for a living. But we didn't have much. And so it's getting about Christmas time. And apparently my wanter was on high. It was at an all-time high. Because at that time, I'm going to age myself, Knight Rider was on television. Yeah, some of y'all little young bucks can go look that up. All right? It was the hottest thing going. Knight Rider. That car. And so I imagine I had all these things that I wanted. And so I'm in the back of my dad's shop, and he comes in off of a call, and I think he forgets that I'm here. And him and my mom start having a conversation about Christmas. And guess what the conversation is about? My dad can't figure out how he's going to buy us Christmas. I don't think I ever told y'all this. And my dad is struggling, and he's trying to talk this thing out with my mom, and they're trying to sort out how much money's coming in and how much money they need to pay out. And I can hear the level of anxiety in my dad's voice. And I couldn't. You're like, how old were you? I'm like, I think I was how old was Knight Rider? Somebody will have to look that up. I was like less than 10, I think. And I'm listening to this, and my heart is like about to beat out of my chest. I still remember it to this day. You want to know why I don't like Christmas? That's why I don't like Christmas. Because my dad was suffering because the world, I think, told him that to be a good dad, he had to do certain things at Christmas. And my dad was a phenomenal dad, and it didn't have anything to do with what he bought me for Christmas. And as like however old I was, 10 years old, my heart is grieving because of how he is suffering for that. And guess what? When that Christmas morning came, I guess I was old enough where Santa Claus was still around because it wasn't wrapped. I still remember it. I don't know if y'all remember this or not. I had a Knight Rider sleeping bag. And on top of that was a Knight Rider watch. A digital Knight Rider watch. It was everything I wanted. And yet when I looked at it, I heard his voice. And I can't tell you how much I wish that it wasn't under that tree. Because even as a kid, I would have rather had a contented father who knew what an amazing person he was than the dad who was trying to do what the world told him he had to do in order to be a dad. And at Christmas, he still didn't think it was enough. And y'all probably know, right? He never thought it was enough. Where did he get an idea that he was never enough? He's the best father you could ask for. Because some marketers told him that. The world told him that. And it was the biggest lie. Because he was amazing. And so here's maybe what I'm trying to tell some of you. This Christmas could get really messed up if you let it. Or we could push against what the world is trying to tell us, and we could present something else. We could present to the world, hey, world, guess what? We have learned to be content in whatever circumstances we are in want or in plenty. Makes no difference to us. Let us pray. Holy Spirit, speak right now in the silence. Father, the world lies to us, and I think my assignment today was to call the lie and to call the bluff and to say that that is not how you designed us to be. And Father, I believe that what we are searching for is this thing called contentment, where it doesn't matter if we have things or we don't have things. But there's just this deeper level of peace and joy and love that comes within us, and that we can hold things loosely. But Father, I know that it will be a battle going into this season. It always is. The world tries to tell us something else, tries to tell us a lie, tries to tell us that there's certain things that'll make us good parents or good whatevers. And Father, I hear you drawing us back to a kind of simplicity where we're not approaching you as a supplier, but we're approaching you as the source of life. And so here's what I pray. Lord, make this season different for those who are in the sound of my voice. Make it different for me. Make it different for the Taylor house on 1160 Dogwood Lane. Make it different, God. Let this be the one season where we're like, man, this was beautiful. Our hearts turned towards you, God. Love of family was different this year. A love of friends was different. And in order to do that, I'm thoroughly convinced of your word to us from Paul in Philippians. There's some things we're going to have to let go of, to detach, so that we can attach to you, the very source of life. I'm going to give you just another minute. Because if I know the enemy, as I think that I do, he's going to try to steal this from you before you even get out the door. So why don't you decide? There's no come forward invitation today. But why don't you decide that you're going to do something different? Yeah, everybody stand with me. If you will, hold your hands out like this. This is the posture of contentment. If you forget, this is the posture of contentment. It's holding things loose. It's deciding not to control things and people so that you can have what really matters. And that's my prayer for you. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you.